Skipping Christmas by John Grisham. Day 6. Luther sat low in the back, thinking of suicide for the first time in his life. The two cops in the front seat were chatting on the radio, something about finding the owner of the stolen property. Their lights were still swirling, and Luther wanted to say so much. "Let me go. I'll sue. Turn off the dang lights. Next year I'll buy 10 calendars. Just go ahead and shoot me." If Nora came home now, she'd file for a divorce. The Kirby twins were eight-year-old delinquents from the far end of Hemlock, and for some reason they happened by. They walked close to the car, close to the rear window, and made direct eye contact with Luther, who squirmed even lower. Then the Bellington brat joined them, and all three peered in at Luther as if he'd killed their mothers. Spike came running, followed by Vic Frohmeyer. The officers got out and had a word with him. Then Treen shooed the kids away and released Luther from the back seat. "He's got keys," Vic was saying, and Luther then remembered that he did indeed have the keys to Trognan's. What a moron. "I know both these men," Frohmeyer continued. "This is no burglary." The cops whispered for a moment as Luther tried to ignore the stares from Vic and Spike. He glanced around, half expecting to see Nora wheel into the drive and have a stroke. "What about the tree?" Salino asked Vic. "If he says Trogdon loaned it to him, then it's the truth. You sure?" "I'm sure." Okay, Salino said, still sneering at Luther as if he'd never seen a guiltier criminal. They slowly got in the car and drove away. "Thanks," Luther said. "What are you doing, Luther?" Vic asked. "I'm borrowing their tree. Spike's helping me move it. Let's go, Spike." Without further interruption, Luther and Spike rolled the tree up the driveway into the garage and grappled with it until it was sitting rather nicely in the front window. Along the way they left a trail of dead needles, red and green icicles, and some popcorn. "I'll vacuum later," Luther said. "Let's check the lights." The phone rang. It was Nora, more panicked than before. "I can't find a thing, Luther. No turkey, no ham, no chocolates, nothing. And I can't find a nice gift either." "Gifts? Why are you shopping for gifts?" "It's Christmas, Luther. Have you called the Yarbers and Friskies?" "Yes," he lied. "Their lines were busy." "Keep calling, Luther, because no one is coming. I've tried the McNears, Morrises, and Warners. They're all busy. How's the tree? Coming along? I'll call later." Spike plugged in the lights and the tree came to life. They attacked the 9 boxes of decorations without a care as to what went where. Across the street, Walt Scheel watched them through binoculars. Chapter 15. Spike was on the ladder, leaning precariously into the tree with a crystal angel in one hand and a fuzzy reindeer in the other, when Luther heard a car in the drive. He glanced out the window and saw Nora's Audi sliding into the garage. "It's Nora," he said. Quick thinking led him to believe that Spike's complicity in the tree should be a secret. "Spike, you need to leave now," he said. "Why?" "Job's over, son. Here's another 20. Thanks a million." He helped the kid down from the ladder, handed over the cash, and led him to the front door. When Nora stepped into the kitchen, Spike eased onto the front steps and disappeared. "Unload the car," she commanded. Her nerves were shot, and she was ready to snap. "What's the matter?" he asked, and immediately wished he'd said nothing. It was quite obvious what was the matter. She rolled her eyes and started to snap, then gritted her teeth and repeated, "Unload the car." Luther high-stepped toward the door and was almost outside when he heard, "What an ugly tree!" He spun, ready for war, and said, "Take it or leave it." "Red lights?" she said, her voice incredulous. Trogdon had used a strand of red lights, one solitary string of them, and wrapped them tightly around the trunk of the tree. Luther had toyed with the idea of pulling them off, but it would have taken an hour. Instead, he and Spike had tried to hide them with ornaments. Nora, of course, had spotted them from the kitchen. Now she had her nose in the tree. "Red lights? We've never used red lights." "They were in the box," Luther lied. He did not enjoy lying, but he knew it would be standard behavior for the next day or so. "Which box?" "What do you mean, which box?" "I've been throwing stuff on the tree as fast as I can open boxes, Nora. Now's not the time to get touchy about the tree." "Green icicles?" she said, picking one off the tree. "Where'd you find this tree?" "I bought the last one from the Boy Scouts." A sidestep, not a direct lie. She looked around the room at the strewn and empty boxes and decided there were more important things to worry about. "Besides," Luther said unwisely, "at the rate we're going, who's going to see it?" "Shut up and unload the car." There were 4 bags of food from a store Luther had never heard of, 3 shopping bags with handles from a clothing store in the mall, a case of soft drinks, a case of bottled water, and a bouquet of dreadful flowers from a florist known for his outrageous prices. Luther's accountant's brain wanted to tally up the damage, but he thought better of it. How would he explain this around the office? All the money he'd saved now went up in smoke, plus the cruise he didn't take getting wasted because he declined to purchase travel insurance. Luther was in the middle of a financial disaster and couldn't do a thing to stop the bleeding. "Did you get the Yarbers and the Friskies?" Nora asked at the phone, the receiver stuck to her head. "Yes, they can't come." "Unpack those groceries," she demanded, then said into the phone, "Sue, it's Nora. Merry Christmas. Look, we've just had a big surprise over here. Blair's coming home with her fiancé, be here tonight, and we're running around like crazy trying to put together a last-minute party." Pause. "Peru. Thought we wouldn't see her till next Christmas." Pause. "Yes, quite a surprise." Pause. "Yes, fiancé." Pause. He's a doctor. Pause. He's from down there somewhere, Peru, I think. She just met him a few weeks ago, and now they're getting married. So needless to say, we're in a shock. So tonight, pause. Luther removed the 8 pounds of smoked Oregon trout, all packed in airtight, thick cellophane wrappers, the type that gave the impression that the fish had been caught years ago. Sounds like a nice party, Nora was saying. Sorry you can't make it. Yes, I'll give a hug to Blair. Merry Christmas, Sue. She hung up and took a deep breath. With the worst possible timing, Luther said, Smoked trout? Either that or frozen pizza, she fired back with glowing eyes and clenched fists. There's not a turkey or ham left in the stores, and even if I found one, there's not enough time to cook it. So yes, Luther, Mr. Beachbum, we're having smoked trout for Christmas. The phone rang and Nora snatched it. Hello, yes, Emily? How are you? Thanks for returning my call. Luther couldn't think of a single person named Emily. He pulled out a 3-pound block of cheddar cheese, a large wedge of Swiss, boxes of crackers, clam dip, and 3 two-day-old chocolate pies from a bakery Nora had always avoided. She was rattling on about their last-minute party when suddenly she said, You can come? That's wonderful. Around 7-ish? Casual. Sort of come and go. Pause. Your parents? Sure, they can come. The more the merrier. Great, Emily. See you in a bit. She hung up without a smile. Emily who? Emily Underwood. Luther dropped a box of crackers. No, he said. She was suddenly interested in unpacking the last bag of groceries. You didn't, Nora, he said. Tell me you didn't invite Mitch Underwood. Not here, not to our house. You didn't, Nora. Please say you didn't. We're desperate. Not that desperate. I like Emily. She's a witch, and you know it. You like her? When's the last time you had lunch with her? Or breakfast, or coffee, or anything? We need bodies, Luther. Mitch the Mouth is not a body. He's a windbag. Under a thundering load of hot air. People hide from the Underwoods, Nora. Why? They're coming. Be thankful. They're coming because nobody in their right mind would invite them to a social occasion. They're always free. Hand me that cheese. This is a joke, right? He'll be good with Enrique. Enrique'll never again set foot in the United States after Underwood gets through with him. He hates everything. The city, the state, Democrats, Republicans, independents, clean air, you name it. He's the biggest bore in the world. He'll get half drunk and you can hear him 2 blocks over. Settle down, Luther. It's done. Speaking of drinking, I didn't have time to get to wine. You'll have to go. I'm not leaving the safety of my home. Yes, you are. I didn't see Frosty. I'm not doing Frosty. I've made up my mind. Yes, you are. The phone rang again and Nora grabbed it. Who could this be? Luther muttered to himself. Can't get any worse. Blair, Nora said. Hello, dear. Give me the phone, Luther kept muttering. I'll send him back to Peru. You're in Atlanta? Great, Nora said. Pause. We're just cooking away, dear. Getting ready for the party. Pause. We're excited too, dear. Can't wait. Pause. Of course I'm making a caramel cream pie for pie, your favorite. She saw at Luther a look of horror. Yes, honey. We'll be at the airport at 6. Love you. Luther glanced at his watch. 3 o'clock. She hung up and said, I need 2 pounds of caramel and a jar of marshmallow cream. I'll finish the tree. It still needs more ornaments, Luther said. I'm not fighting the mobs. Nora chewed a fingernail for a second and assessed things. This meant a plan was coming, probably one with a lot of detail. Let's do this, she began. Let's finish the decorating by 4. How long will Frosty take? 3 days. At 4, I'll make the final run to town, and you get Frosty up on the roof. Meanwhile, we'll go through the phone book and call everybody we've ever met. Don't tell anyone. Underwoods are coming. Hush, Luther. Smoked trout with Mitch Underwood. That'll be the hottest ticket in town. Nora put on a Sinatra's Christmas CD, and for 20 minutes Luther flung more ornaments on Trogdon's tree while Nora set out candles and ceramic Santas and decorated the fireplace mantel with plastic holly and mistletoe. They said nothing to each other for a long time, when then Nora broke the ice with more instructions. These boxes can go back to the attic. Of all the things Luther hated about Christmas, perhaps the most dreaded chore was hauling boxes up and down the retractable stairs of the attic, up the staircase to the 2nd floor, then wedge into the narrow hallway between bedrooms, then readjust positions so that the box, which was inevitably too big, could be shoved up the flimsy ladder through the opening to the attic. Coming down or going up, it didn't matter. It was a miracle he'd avoided serious injury over the years. And after that, start bringing Frosty up, she barked like an admiral. She leaned hard on Reverend Zabriskie, and he finally said he could stop by for half an hour. Luther, at gunpoint, called his secretary, Docs, and twisted her arm until she agreed to stop by for a few minutes. Docs had been married three times and was currently unmarried, but always had a boyfriend of some variety. The 2 of them, plus Reverend and Mrs. Brasky, plus the Underwood group, totaled an optimistic 8, if they all converged at the same time. 12 altogether with the Cranks and Blair and Enrique. 12 almost made Nora cry again. 12 would seem like 3 in their living room on Christmas Eve. She called her 2 favorite wine stores. One was closed, and the other one would be open for a half hour. At 4, Nora left in a flurry of instructions for Luther, who, by then, was thinking of hitting the cognac hidden in the basement. Chapter 16. Just minutes after Nora left, the phone rang. Luther grabbed it. Maybe it was Blair again. He'd tell her the truth. He'd give her a piece of his mind about how thoughtless this last-minute surprise was. How selfish. She'd get her feelings hurt, but she'd get over it. With a wedding on the way, she'd need more than ever. "Hello," he snapped. "Luther, it's Mitch Underwood," came a booming voice, the sound of which made Luther want to stick his head into the oven. "Hi, Mitch. Merry Christmas to you. Hey, look, thanks for the invite and all, but we just can't squeeze you guys in. Lots of invitations, you know." Oh, yes, the Underwoods were on everyone's A-list. Folks clamored for Mitch's insufferable tirades on property taxes and city zoning. "Gee, I'm real sorry, Mitch," Luther said. "Maybe next year." "Sure, give us a call. Merry Christmas, Mitch." The gathering of 12 was now down to 8, with more defections on the way. Before Luther could take a step, the phone was ringing again. "Mr. Crank? It's me, Docs," came a struggling voice. "Hello, Docs. Sorry about your cruise and all." "You've already said that." "Yes, look, something's come up. This guy I'm seeing was going to surprise me with dinner at Tanner Hall. Champagne, caviar, the works. He made a reservation a month ago. I really can't say no to him." "Of course you can't, Docs. He's hiring a limo, everything. He's a real sweetheart." "Sure he is, Docs. We just can't make it to your place, but I'd love to see Blair." Blair'd been gone a month. Docs hadn't seen her in 2 years. "I'll tell her." "Sorry, Mr. Crank." "No problem." Down to 6. 3 cranks plus Enrique and the Reverend and Mrs. Zabriskie. He also called Nora to break the bad news, but what... He almost called Nora to break the bad news, but why bother? Poor thing was out there beating her brains out. Why make her cry? Why give her another reason to bark at him for his grand idea gone bad? Luther was closer to the Cognac than he wanted to admit. Spike Fromeyer reported all he'd seen and heard. With $40 in his pocket and a fading vow of silence floating around out there, he was at first hesitant to talk, but then no one kept quiet on Hemlock. After a couple of parting volleys from his father, Vic, he unloaded everything. He reported how he'd been paid to help take the tree from Trogdon's, how he'd helped Mr. Crank set it up in the living room, then practically thrown on ornaments and lights, how Mr. Crank had kept sneaking to the telephone and calling people, how he'd heard just enough to know that the Cranks were planning a last-minute party for Christmas Eve, but nobody wanted to come. He couldn't determine the reason for the party or why it was being put together so hastily, primarily because Mr. Crank used the phone in the kitchen and kept his voice low. Mrs. Crank was running errands and calling every 10 minutes. Things were very tense down at the Cranks, according to Spike. Vic called Ned Becker, who'd been alerted by Walt Scheel, and soon the three of them were on a conference call with Walt and Ned maintaining visual contact with the Crank home. "She just left again, in a hurry," reported Walt. "I've never seen Nora speed away so fast." "Where's Luther?" asked Fromeyer. "Still inside," answered Walt. "Looks like they've finished with the tree. Gotta say, I liked it better at the Trogdons." "Something's going on," said Ned Becker. Nora had a case of wine in her shopping cart. 6 bottles of red and 6 bottles of white, although she wasn't sure why she was buying so much. Who exactly was going to drink it all? Perhaps she would. She'd picked out the expensive stuff, too. She wanted Luther to burn when he got the bill. All this money they were going to save at Christmas, and look at the mess they were in. A clerk in the front of the wine shop was pulling the blinds and locking the door. The lone cashier was hustling the last customers through the line. 3 people were ahead of Nora, 1 behind. Her cell phone rang in her coat pocket. "Hello," she half whispered. "Nora, Doug Zabriskie." "Hello, Father," she said, and began to limp. His voice betrayed him. "We're having a bit of a problem over here," he began sadly. "Typical Christmas Eve chaos, you know, everybody running in different directions. And Beth's aunt from Toledo just dropped in, quite unexpected, and made things worse. I'm afraid it'll be impossible to stop by and see Blair tonight." He sounded as if he hadn't seen Blair in years. "That's too bad," Nora managed to say, with just a trace of compassion. She wanted to curse and cry at the same time. "We'll do it another time." "No problem, then?" "Not at all, Father." They signed off with Merry Christmases and such, and Nora bit her quivering lip. She paid for the wine, then hauled it half-mile to her car, grumbling about her husband every heavy step of the way. She hiked to a Kroger, fought her way through a mob in the entrance, and trudged down the aisles in search of caramels. She called Luther, and no one answered. He'd better be up on the roof. They met in front of the peanut butter, both seeing each other at the same time. She recognized the shock of red hair, the orange-gray beard, and the little black round eyeglasses, but she couldn't think of his name. He, however, said, "Merry Christmas, Nora," immediately. "And Merry Christmas to you," she said with a quick, warm smile. Something bad had happened to his wife. Either she'd died from some disease or taken off with a younger man. They'd met a few years earlier at a ball, black tie, she thought. Later she'd heard about his wife. What was his name? Maybe he worked at the university. He was well-dressed in a cardigan under a handsome trench coat. "Why are you out running around?" he asked. He was carrying a basket with nothing in it. "Oh, last-minute stuff, you know. And you?" She got the impression he was doing nothing at all, and that he was out with the whores just for the sake of being there, and that he was probably lonely. What in the world happened to his wife? No wedding band visible. Picking up a few things. Big meal tomorrow, huh? He asked, glancing at his peanut butter. Tonight, actually. Our daughter's coming in from South America, and we're putting together a quick little party. Blair? Yes. He knew Blair. Jumping off a cliff, Nora instinctively said, Why don't you stop by? You mean that? Oh, sure. It's a come and go. Lots of folks. Lots of good food. She thought of the smoked trout and wanted to gag. Surely his name would come back in a flash. What time? He asked, visibly delighted. Earlier the better. Say about 7? He glanced at his watch. Just about 2 hours. 2 hours? Nora had a watch, but from someone else the time sounded so awful. 2 hours. Oh well, gotta run, she said. You're on Hemlock? He said. Yes, 1478. Who was this man? She scampered away, practically praying that his name would come roaring back from somewhere. She found the caramels, the marshmallow cream, and the pie shells. The express lane, 10 items or less, had a line that stretched down to frozen foods. Nora fell in with the rest, barely able to see the cashier, unwilling to glance at her watch, teetering on the edge of a complete and total surrender. Chapter 17. He waited as long as he could, though he had not a second to spare. Darkness would hit fast at 5:30, and in the frenzy of the moment, Luther had tucked away somewhere the crazy notion of hanging old Frosty under the cover of darkness. It wouldn't work, and he knew it, but rational thought was hard to grasp and hold. He spent a few moments planning the project. An attack from the rear of the house was mandatory. No way would he allow Walt Scheel or Vic Frohmeyer or anybody else to see him in action. Luther wrestled Frosty out of the basement without injuring either one of them, but he was cursing vigorously by the time they made it to the patio. He hauled a ladder from the storage shed in the backyard. So far he had not been seen, or at least he didn't think so. The roof was slightly wet with a patch of ice or two, and it was much colder up there. With a 1/4-inch nylon rope tied around his waist, Luther crawled upward, cat-like and terrified, over the asphalt shingles until he reached the summit. He peeked over the crown of the roof and peered below. The Scheels were directly in front of him, way down there. He looped the rope around the chimney, then inched backward, until he hit a patch of ice and slid for 2 feet. Catching himself, he paused and allowed his heart to start working again. He looked down in terror. If by some tragedy he fell, he'd free fall for a brief flight, then land among the metal patio furniture sitting on hard brick. Death would not be instant. No, sir. He'd suffer, and if he didn't die, he'd have a broken neck or maybe brain damage. How utterly ridiculous. A 54-year-old man playing games like this. The most horrifying trick of all was to remount the ladder from above, which he managed to do by digging his fingernails into the shingles while dangling 1 foot at a time over the gutter. Back on the ground, he took a deep breath and congratulated himself for surviving the first trip to the top and back. There were 4 parts to Frosty: a wide round base, then a snowball, then the trunk with one arm waving and one hand on hip, then the head with a smiling face, corncob pipe, and black top hat. Luther grumbled as he put the danged thing together, snapping one plastic section into another. He screwed the light bulb into the midsection, plugged in the 80-foot extension cord, hooked the nylon rope around Frosty's waist, and maneuvered him into position for the ride up. It was 4:45. His daughter and her brand-new fiancé would land in an hour and 15 minutes. The drive to the airport took 20 minutes, plus more for parking, shuttling, walking, pushing, shoving. Luther wanted to give up and start drinking, but he pulled the rope tight around the chimney and Frosty started up. Luther climbed with him up the ladder, worked him over the gutter and onto the shingles. Luther would pull, Frosty would move a little. He was no more than 40 pounds of hard plastic, but soon felt much heavier. Slowly they made their way up, side by side, Luther on all fours, Frosty inching along his back. Just a hint of darkness, but no real relief from the skies. Once the little team reached the crown, Luther would be exposed. He'd be forced to stand while he grappled with his snowman and attached him to the front of the chimney, and once in place, illuminated with the 200-watt Old Frosty would join his 41 companions, and all of Hemlock would know that Luther had caved. So he paused for a moment just below the summit and tried to tell himself that he didn't care what his neighbors thought or said. He clutched the rope that held Frosty, rested on his back, and looked at the clouds above him, and realized he was sweating and freezing. They would laugh and snicker and tell Luther's skipping Christmas stories for years to come, and he'd be the butt of the jokes. But did it really matter? Blair would be happy, Enrique would see a real American Christmas, Nora would hopefully be placated. Then he thought of the island princess, casting off tomorrow from Miami, minus 2 passengers, headed for the beaches and the islands Luther had been lusting for. He felt like throwing up. Walt Scheel had been in the kitchen where Bev was finishing a pie, and out of habit now he walked to his front window to observe the Crank house. Nothing at first, then he froze. Peeking over the roof next to the chimney was Luther. Then slowly Walt saw Frosty's black hat, then his face. then his face. "Bev!" he yelled. Luther dragged himself up, looked around quickly as if he were a burglar, braced himself on the chimney, then began tugging on Frosty. "You must be kidding," Bev said, wiping her hands on a dish towel. Walt was laughing too, hard to say anything. He grabbed the phone to call Frohmeyer and Becker. When Frosty was in full view, Luther carefully swung him around to the front of the chimney, to the spot where he wanted to stand. His plan was to somehow hold him there for a second while he wrapped a 2-inch wide canvas band around his rather large midsection and secured it firmly around the chimney, just like last year. It had worked fine then. Vic Frohmeyer ran to the basement, where his children were watching a Christmas movie. "Mr. Craig's putting up his Frosty. You guys go watch, but stay on the sidewalk." The basement emptied. There was a patch of ice on the front side of the roof, just inches from the chimney and virtually invisible to Luther. With Frosty in place but not attached, and while Luther was struggling to remove the nylon rope and pull tight the electrical cord and secure the canvas band around the chimney, and just as he was to make perhaps the most dangerous move of the entire operation, he heard voices below. And when he turned to see who was watching, he had inadvertently stepped on the patch of ice just below the crown, and everything fell at once. Frosty tipped over and was gone, careening down the front of the roof with nothing to hold him back, no ropes, no cords, bands, nothing. Luther was right behind him, but fortunately Luther had managed to entangle himself with everything, sliding headfirst down the steep roof and yelling loud enough for Walt and Bever to hear indoors. Luther sped like an avalanche towards certain death. Later he would recall, to himself of course, that he clearly remembered the fall. Evidently there was more ice on the front of the roof than on the rear, and once he found it, he felt like a hockey puck. He well remembered flying off the roof head first with the concrete driveway awaiting him, and he remembered hearing, but not seeing, Frosty crash somewhere nearby. Then the sharp pain as his fall was stopped, pain around his ankles as the rope and extension cord abruptly ran out of slack, jerking poor Luther like a bullwhip, but no doubt saving his life. Watching Luther shoot down the roof on his stomach, seemingly in pursuit of his bouncing Frosty, was more than Walt Scheel could stand. He ached with laughter, but he bent at the waist. Until he bent at the waist, Bev watched in horror. "Shut up, Walt," she yelled. "Do something," as Luther was hanging and spinning well above the concrete, his feet not far from the gutter. Luther swung and spun helplessly above his driveway. After a few turns, the cord and rope were tightly braided together and the spinning stopped. He felt sick and closed his eyes for a second. "How do you vomit when you're upside down?" Walt punched 911. He reported that a man had been injured and might be dying on Hemlock, so send the rescue people immediately. Then he ran out of the house and across the street where the Frohmeyer children were gathering under Luther. Vic Frohmeyer was running from 2 houses down. The entire Becker clan from next door was spilling out of their house. "Poor Frosty," Luther heard one of the children say. "Poor Frosty, my butt," he wanted to say. The nylon rope was cutting into the flesh around his ankles. He was afraid to move because the rope seemed to give just a little. He was still 8 feet above the ground, and a fall would be disastrous. Inadvertently, Luther tried to breathe and collect his wits. He heard Frohmeyer's big mouth. "Would somebody please shoot me?" "Luther, you okay?" asked Frohmeyer. "Swell, Vic, thanks. And you?" Luther began rotating slightly, turning very slowly in the wind. Soon he pivoted back toward the street and came face to face with his neighbors, the last people he wanted to see. "Get a ladder," someone said. "Is that an electrical cord around his feet?" asked someone. Where is the rope attached?" asked another. All voices were familiar, but Luther couldn't distinguish them. "I called 911, he heard Walt Scheel say. "Thanks, Walt," Luther said loudly in the direction of the crowd, but he was revolving back toward the house. "I think Frosty's dead," one teenager mumbled to another. Hanging there, waiting for death, waiting for the rope to slip, then give completely and send him crashing down, Luther hated Christmas with a renewed passion. Look what Christmas was doing to him. All because of Christmas. And he hated his neighbors too, all of them, young and old. They were gathering in his driveway by the dozens now. He could hear them coming, and as he rotated slowly, he could glimpse them running down the street to see this sight. The cord and the rope popped somewhere above him, then gave, and Luther fell another 6 inches before he was jerked to a stop. The crowd gasped. No doubt some of them wanted to cheer. Frohmeyer was barking orders as if he handled these situations every day. 2 ladders arrived, and one was placed on each side of Luther. Ned Becker yelled from the back patio that he'd found what was holding the electrical cord and the nylon rope, and, in his very experienced opinion, it wouldn't hold much longer. "Did you plug in the extension cord?" Frohmeyer asked. "No," answered Luther. "We're going to get you down, okay?" "Yes, please." Frohmeyer was climbing one ladder, Ned Becker the other. Luther was aware that Swade Kerr was down there, as were Ralph Brixley and John Gaddy and some of the older boys on the street. "My life is in their hands," Luther said to himself and closed his eyes. He weighed 174, down to 11 for the cruise, and he was quite concerned with how exactly they planned to untangle him, then lower him to the ground. His rescuers were middle-aged men who, if they broke a sweat, did so on the golf course. Certainly not powerlifting. Swade Kerr was a frail vegetarian who could barely pick up his newspaper, and right then he was under Luther, hoping to help lower him to the ground. "What's the plan here, Vic?" Luther asked. It was difficult to talk with his feet straight above him. Gravity was pulling all the blood to his head, and it was pounding. Vic hesitated. They really didn't have a plan. What Luther couldn't see was that a group of men was standing directly under him to break any fall. What Luther could hear, though, were two things. First, someone said, "There's Nora." Then he heard sirens.